All right, it is 1 o'clock, so I think we are going to begin because I know there's so much to cover today. My name is Annette Donovan Pancho. I am one of the campus ministers here at King's University College. I'm the host of the Catholic Current series. I think we are in for a real treat today. We have Sister Nuala Kenny here with us from Halifax. Sister Nuala is a Sister of Charity of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, a retired pediatrician and medical ethicist, and an officer of the Order of Canada, past president of the Canadian Pediatric Society and the Canadian Bioethics Society. She's now emeritus professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is author and lecturer. Her research interests continue in palliative and end-of-life care, healing the church from clergy sexual abuse, and just health policies. I know we are in for such a treat today. Sister Nuala is going to be speaking to us for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a short period of time to ask any questions. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sister Nuala. Take it away.
Thank you, dear. Thank you. I appreciate that. And excuse me. Greetings to everybody from Halifax, where we're expecting a winter storm. Can you believe it? So I think, as you heard, it's probably fortuitous because I think the timing of the talk about end of life in the Catholic tradition was not aware of the fact that this talk I'm giving is right in the last 3 weeks before the final legislation for the medically assisted death issue here in Canada. So the timing could not be more crucial in terms of helping understand what is our tradition, why the tradition is what it is, and some of what has happened in the medicalization of suffering and death. So the first thing I'd like to do is, and fittingly it is the year of St. Joseph, I want to get you to share a bit for a minute, kind of internally. It's a shame that we can't do this live. It's just so rich. This is a medieval painting, but it's capturing the death of St. Joseph, who, as you all know, is the patron of a good death. Now, it is a medieval and it's flourished and all that. Don't pay attention to that part. I want you to look at the scene and the characters in the scene just for a minute. It requires more, but just for a minute. And I want you to notice the elements that you see that, in fact, you would identify as elements in your death if it was a good death. This is not a sufficient time, but in light of our circumstances, I want to tell you some of the things that have been mentioned by the many, many groups with whom I've shared this. The first that almost everyone notes is that Joseph is surrounded by Mary and Jesus. He is not dying alone. He is dying with the love and support of his loved ones. Most note that he's dying at home, in their place. Many are also struck by the fact that Joseph and Jesus, the foster father and Son are fixed on each other. For some, that's Joseph praying to Jesus. Not for me. That's the foster father and the Jesus who was taught to be a man, looking at each other, father and son. Almost everyone notes that Jesus is holding Joseph's hand, connecting. It's not Joseph holding Jesus's hand, it's Jesus holding Joseph's hand. And the final thing I want to share with you is that when we have time to stop and immerse ourselves, people are struck by this scene being one of sadness, but of peace. And I can assure you as a physician, this is not the frenetic emergency room, hospital bed, disaster, code blue, zap, bring a machine in. This is a place where Joseph, the just man, is ready to go to his creator and to be judged as having done the best that he could for what the Lord asked him. So it's medieval insight into a deep tradition. My goals for our reflection, I'm going to, remember, I'm a lecturer, I'm a medical lecturer, so I got to do it this way. I want you to know that in the brief time we have, I'm really trying to bring you through a number of issues. First, I want us to do a kind of rapid review on the Catholic Christian spirituality of sickness and death and dying, and a review of our moral theology, the best of our moral tradition for the care of the dying, and particularly those who in fact have been dying in situations of distress. Second thing I want us to do is I want us to acknowledge and be aware of the magnitude of the challenges to that tradition presented by the February 2015 Supreme Court of Canada decision that overnight turned the prohibition against intentionally ending the life of another, even when requested, which is in the Hippocratic tradition 400 years before Christianity, to an obligation, a right to be assisted in your death, in your death by medication and technology, and required participation by doctors who had professed to be agents of life. Third, in the context of all of this, I want to identify the importance of palliative care and hospice, and how they have been championed by Catholic healthcare as most compatible with a good death, and in fact, as the issues that we saw as an alternative to, if done well, an alternative to medically assisted death. And then I'm going to propose to you something that we're working on in my diocese, and I'm working on in a number of others, the importance of advanced care planning. That is, advanced care planning as a spiritual activity in this day and age, when members of your own family may think differently about medically assisted death, about dying, about technology, about end of life. But more the need for you and your loved ones to reflect on our spirituality and theology and medically assisted death in the light of our tradition. And then finally, I want us all to accept the challenges of ministry of care and companionship for all of us in the church. This is just a summary from a vast number of references in the medical literature on what people in North America in the last 10 years would have described as the characteristics of a good death. Right now, in your mind, go back to Joseph's death and the features that I pointed out that people have appreciated. And now this is a technical professional analysis of people's comments. 1, non-abandonment and continuity of care. The most important thing for most people is to not die alone. Moreover, not just not die alone, but to in fact be comforted by their loved ones and to have care, not necessarily technological, but care, the support continuing regardless of whether they're dying a slow death or a rapid complex death. Second, interestingly and paradoxically now with medically assisted death, throughout the late 80s and 90s and into the beginning of the 2000s, people identified the avoidance of unwanted technological intervention as important. That is, they didn't want to die with tubes coming out of every orifice. They didn't want to die with technology still, and some of you would have visited your dying loved ones, and they're still coming in to poke to check blood oxygen saturation and blood sugar when the person is clearly dying. They didn't want that unwanted technological intervention. Third, huge issue. Persons who are sick and dying want respectful communication. No matter how ill they are, they want to be involved as much as they can be in understanding what's going on for themselves and for their loved ones. And then finally, and this in the Joseph's death, we saw this, they want to have an opportunity to complete life's last things. And I don't mean the bucket list. I don't mean climb Mount Everest and swim in the South Pacific. I mean, thank you to those who you should thank. I forgive you to those you need to forgive. Can you forgive me for those whom you have harmed? So our spiritual tradition based in Joseph was very strong. And when we have Jesus and his own life and experience, this is where our spiritual reflection is going to begin, because it has to begin with Jesus's care of the sick and the dying. And this happens to be, especially for all of the women watching, this is my favorite cure. I have a whole lecture that's nothing but Jesus's cures. This is my favorite. For those of you who don't recognize it, this is the woman with the hemorrhage. Only the women in the room know what it means to constantly have blood flow, to constantly be embarrassed, to constantly feel unclean, to be made unclean. She couldn't go into the courtyard of the temple. She was set apart because she was ritually unclean. She hears of this Jesus. She doesn't even think herself worthy enough to go and say, Rabbi, could you heal me? All she wants to do is touch the hem of his cloak. And what happens when that happens? Jesus stops in the middle of the crowd, pushing and shoving and pushing and shoving. He says, someone touched me. And the apostles think he's crazy. They think he's Jesus. Everybody's shoving you. Someone touched me. So we need to root ourselves in this understanding, because if we look at all of the elements of Jesus's care of sick and suffering and dying persons, these are the three that we have to pay attention to. He gave physical cure and comfort. Jesus didn't simply say to those who are sick, suck it up. This is redemption, just suck it up. He didn't do that. He didn't have that coarse kind of suffering is suffering aspect. He provided physical cure and comfort. So we're going to see how this falls an obligation to us. Second, the amazing thing, think of my woman with the hemorrhage. He actually not only could cure physically, but he could heal. Healing is not the same thing. Healing has to do with the attention to the whole person. In his healing, he restored what I call the disintegration of serious and life-threatening illness. Any of you who've been sick, I'm a breast cancer survivor and I'm now 76. I know about disintegration. You can be sick. You actually not only feel pieces are falling off you, but functions and abilities are falling away from you. You're disintegrating, you're falling apart. He restores that disintegration of serious and life-threatening illness by restoring a sense of the innate dignity and lovableness, no matter what her condition. And he also attends to body, mind, and spirit. He understands that this is about spiritual and emotional issues as well as physical. And third, most important for us, our final challenge, he restored her to the community. She's not isolated anymore. If Jesus gives a witness in care of the sick, look at the witness he gives in suffering and dying. In my book, Rediscovering the Art of Dying, which is the title and you could go buy that book at Novalis if you'd like to. I start the very first, every chapter has to do with Jesus's experience and what it says to us in contemporary medicine and healthcare and culture. This is Gethsemane, my favorite story of Jesus. Why? Because he's down there on his knees saying, I don't want to do this, Father. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. That's when I know he's human. That's when I know it's true. As Hebrews says, for it is not as if we had a high priest who was incapable of feeling our weakness with us. We have one who has been tempted in every way that we are, though he is without sin. From just that, the hint of the incredible richness of our spiritual tradition and Jesus as witness, let's look at how the church has developed a moral tradition based on these beliefs. This is for the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it's such an important issue. It's one I find most Roman Catholics historically have not understood. Life and physical health are precious gifts entrusted to us by God. We must take reasonable care of them, taking into account the needs of others and the common good. Reasonable care of them. Followed immediately by, if morality requires respect for the life of the body, it does not make it an absolute value. This is where particularly some of my well-intentioned but misinformed pro-life colleagues have done us a disservice, because they have in fact approached issues without a sense of reasonable care, as if everything must be done to prolong biologic life, which is not the teaching of the church. In fact, Pius VI has this incredible quote that anyone who believes that everything should be done, in fact, is guilty of a kind of heresy of the body. So our moral tradition says this is a gift. Our medical decisions are taking care of our health and our body, serious obligation, but in fact, reasonable care when we're sick, reasonable. We, in fact, in our tradition, are supported in our right to make decisions about care that is, in fact, appropriate or inappropriate. And historically, the church contributed to the ethics world this language of extraordinary and ordinary care. This is John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, a major work on ethics. To forego extraordinary or disproportionate means is not the equivalent of suicide or euthanasia. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. See, it builds on, you don't have to do everything. It builds on, there is a balance between the burden of an intervention and the benefit that it might give to us. And the right to determine that balance belongs to the individual, to the patient. One of the issues that is very confused, and it comes to Jesus's witness of care for the physical, is the use of pain control. Now, remember this quote from the Catechism, and then the most recent comment, and Pope Francis in 2020 just received from the Congregation of the Doctor of the Faith. This is November 2020, so this is hot off the press. The most recent Samaritanis Bonus, the most recent hierarchical teaching that includes a whole host of things about end-of-life care. I would encourage you to read it. It's actually got very interesting, and I'll be quoting a few things that reinforce the tradition here. This is important. The use of painkillers to alleviate the sufferings of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity if death is not willed as either an end or a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. It's a consequence. It's the difference between all medicine has your intended goal and the consequences. How many of you have had a wonderful antibiotic and then you've got a hypersensitivity allergic reaction? You have surgery and you wind up with a blood clot. The issue of painkillers becomes crucially important, because while we do believe that suffering is salvific and we can participate in the salvific suffering of Jesus, this does not mean that we're forced to experience pain at any and all cost. And when we're going to see that when we talk about the issue of palliative sedation is when, in fact, the balance between the benefit of the drug and its risk, particularly if it's an opiate, where sedation, loss of consciousness, is the side effect, that in fact, some persons in extreme circumstances of pain and suffering, because we're very careful to ensure people remain conscious as long as they can in our tradition, because of the prayer, because of their need to, in fact, remain open to God till the very last possible moment. But we also know that there are persons who are so racked with their pain that they can't pray. And in fact, pain control becomes one of the most important issues, not only in helping them with their physical issues, but also with their spiritual. And let's be very clear. This catechism comment really should be rewritten, because where it says, even at the risk of shortening their days, this is what we know from palliative care. Proper palliative care, titration of pain, even with more opiates, titration over time, can give people massive doses that would kill you or me if they injected us, because we're not on opiates. But because of the way in which it's done carefully, there's a tolerance that develops to this. So when done properly, pain management does not cause death. I mean, if you intended and didn't overload, clearly, but this is not what proper pain management does. And then this hugely problematic issue for us of medically assisted nutrition and hydration. Again, if we look at this is the Health Ethics Guide from Canada, approved by the Canadian bishops. This expression here, medically assisted nutrition and hydration, become morally optional whenever they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life, or whenever they would be excessively burdensome for the patient. Now, this is what I want you to be really, really clear about. There is a distinct difference between feeding and medical intervention with either an oral tube or a tube that has to go into the duodenum and feeds intravenously. These are both medical interventions, and they should be decided on the risk-benefit assessment of any medical intervention. Feeding, on the other hand, little sips of water. I mean, I keep saying to folks who have done my whole life of palliative care, if grandpa's dying in the ICU or in the hospice and he loves Guinness, I'm going to bring him Guinness. I'm going to let him have his little sips. I don't want him to choke, but the point I'm making is this is the continuity of care when we can feed, when we can in fact provide. But this is not an obligation to insert medical tubes. It isn't. And Samaritanis Bonus emphasizes all of this, and even more extremely, that whether the person is dying and in fact is now in comfort care or not, that in fact continuity of care, emotional, physical, and spiritual, is essential. If we now go directly to persons who are seriously ill and dying, I want us to remember this is the scene. This is real life, real people, real dying. And palliative care was developed, as I said earlier, to in fact provide the environment in the contemporary world of medical science and technology, which is a machine-oriented, medical-oriented, institutionally oriented care system. And what I spent my whole life in, it's important. But palliative care was developed with a philosophy that was attempting to, in fact, make the issue of care of the dying respectful again. Some of you may be old enough to know, I've had situations like this. I remember times when, especially in internship when I was very young, there was a dying person. They were put at the end of the ward and doctors didn't even round on them because doctors believed there's nothing more I can do. What? You can't provide comfort. You can't be medically managing their pain and other symptoms. You can't be ensuring their spirit. So palliative care developed to provide an environment, and these are the characteristics. Palliative care's original philosophy, and it's still the World Palliative Care Association statement, it neither hastens nor prolongs death. Remember that when we look at medically assisted suicide. Neither hastens nor prolongs death. It balances pain and symptom control with participation in the last things. Remember those last things, the spiritual last things? Thank you, goodbye, I'm sorry, forgive me. It focuses not only on the dying person, but on their loved ones, on their intimate others who are in fact experiencing suffering with the dying and who sometimes actually have to decide for the dying. Today, our challenge is to protect palliative care from medically assisted death. It was developed as an alternative to medically assisted death and now is being co-opted. Because this is the Supreme Court of Canada, February 2015 decision. I still remember I literally was sick to my stomach when it came out and I had a chance to read the full, and I don't read court documents, but I was sick to heart. I knew exactly where we were going with this. The Supreme Court of Canada, we're the only country in the world who by a judicial fiat overnight changed the situation to make assistance in dying obligatory because they had a right to it. This is a Charter of Rights and Freedoms challenge. And the Supreme Court provided medically assisted death. Notice the acronym is MAD, not MAID, for medically assisted death, for competent adults who had a grievous medical condition, including an illness, disease, or disability that is irremediable, cannot be relieved by means acceptable to the individual, causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her life. What I want you to notice is there's not one mention of death or dying. This was never intended to be about terminal care. It's grievous. There's no definition of grievous. Serious. It's irremediable. We live with chronic illness. It's one of the features of our time. And it can't be, here, you don't even have to try. You don't even have to try a remedy. The person has to say, no, I wouldn't like that remedy, so I won't take it, and I'm now eligible for medically assisted death. The third point is the one we pay attention to now. This is all about suffering. This is about suffering. This is about the medicalization of human suffering. And if you want to know and it's the medical suffering, the medicalization of suffering and dying and the dying process. Look at this. The reasons for requesting medically assisted death, survey after survey. Hardly ever for pain control, especially if they're in good palliative care. But they request it because of feelings of loss of dignity, dependence and loss of control, guilt at being a burden to others, isolation and loneliness, and uncertainty regarding future care needs. And then hopelessness and loss of meaning because their spiritual needs are unmet. We are still working on this, as I said at the beginning, because This Supreme Court decision had to have a stay for legislative reform because it was a Supreme Court judgment. It had no legislation. So Bill C-14 attempted to legislate what they called medical assistance in dying. And they added two things. For reasonably foreseen natural death. They attempted to return this issue to the issue of terminal illness and dying persons. Immediately, that was in fact the object of an objection to the courts, and we're going to see that came back again in our time in Bill C-7. But they also said that the issue of mature minors, advanced directives, that is, I tell you what I want about medically assisted death while I'm still competent for a time when I'm not competent, when in fact this is supposed to be about competent choice. And crucially, psychiatric illness as the sole condition for eligibility. Well, all of that was in the works for ages. By the time we come to our time today and this month and next, we're into Bill C-7. And the issue here is twofold that I think are most important. First, there is no, despite the Supreme Court of Canada decision and Bill C-14 saying there would be protection of conscientious objection about participation in this, and there would be protection of the vulnerable, they've all gone. They have all gone. What we see now in Bill C-7, even though I'm working with a group of docs desperately trying to include conscientious objection, it's not going to happen. The only way it will happen is the First Nations indigenous persons have registered an objection, citing they should have the ability to object because it doesn't fit with indigenous beliefs and values. But traditional Catholic Christian values have no sway in the marketplace. And second thing is, from the very beginning, the Supreme Court of Canada wanted no restrictions on suffering being responded to by death. Death is now the treatment for suffering. There's no pill, so you end the life and then you assume that you'll end the suffering. Most important then is for our understanding, sorry, just I have to check my time here. Okay, we're good. Our understanding that, and this is a beautiful expression that Pope Benedict has said in 2009. Euthanasia is a false solution to the drama of suffering, a solution unworthy of humans. Indeed, the true response cannot be to put someone to death, however kindly, but rather to witness to the love that helps people to face their pain and agony in a human way. And interestingly, and we were talking before we started the session today, the media valorization of a good death being planned on April 14th at 2:00 in the afternoon with Brahms on the background and my little puppy by my side with all my friends raising a toast with Guinness, that is valorized as this is death with dignity. This is what it's all about. And there is no portrayal of any kind of the traditional death with dignity in the sense of the death of Joseph and the death of those who can in fact accept and move into death in a way that accepts it. This is even more important because surveys have shown that up to 70% of Roman Catholics think medical aid, euthanasia, and assisted suicide is perfectly okay. Samaritatis Bonus, this newest document from the Congregation of the Doctor of the Faith, gives this beautiful little description of cultural obstacles in our day to the sacred value of every human life. We have obstacles to the understanding of dignity as choice and individual choice, rather than our understanding of dignity for each and every child of God is inherent, no matter what your physical or mental state. Death with dignity being death as a control, valorization of autonomy and choice over all other values, misunderstanding of compassion. Compassion means to suffer with. Compassion means that we are willing to enter into and support those who are sick and seriously ill and dying, and to ourselves become wounded in the interaction to support them. But most importantly, I want you to pay attention to this. Having been the chief of 2 children's hospitals with machines that do wonderful things, what we have come to believe is that there are medical and technological solutions to all our issues and all our distress. You Google the meaning of life. You go online for anything and everything that might be distressing. You have cosmetic plastic surgery because you think your nose is too big. We have looked for medical technological solutions to all of our distress. So why should it surprise us that in fact it doesn't happen for end of life? Benedict again, in the message for the World Day of the Sick in 28, put it this way. Human life, however, has intrinsic limitations with all the wonders that we have in technology for prolonging life and for restoring function. Intrinsic limitations, and sooner or later it ends in death. This is an experience to which each human being is called, and one for which he or she must be prepared. In this day and age, where there's not one of you watching that either doesn't agree with medically assisted death and or have other members of your family who agree with medically assisted death. So you have a son who's saying, hey, mama, I know you don't have to cope with this, mama. You really don't. Come on, there's another thing now. You could have it. These issues are happening all of the time, and yet these choices for medically assisted death are supposed to be free and informed. I talk about the fragility of truly free and informed consent. But it means that in the light of these circumstances, we now have to think about our death and dying. And so I am, as I've said, proposed that advanced care planning as a spiritual activity is now becoming obligatory for all of us. The elements are a clarification of our values and hopes for care in the circumstance when we lack capacity. No matter how confused I get, if this is a major decision, you come first to me. But if I lack capacity, I need to have had a clarification about this, and then a conversation with family, friends, healthcare providers around these. I don't have children religious, but I mean, I need my family, I need my brothers who are my families to know and understand my values and hopes, because their job is not to do for me what they want to do or what they think is best for me. When they have my advance directive, when they become my substitute decision maker, they carry the gift and the challenge to speak for me as I would want when I cannot. And then finally, with all of these issues, any one of which we could have stopped and had a whole lecture on, I believe, and I work and I chair for my own Archbishop, our Ministry of Care and Companionship Committee. That's the committee in our Archdiocese that promotes visiting of the sick in parishes, the ministry where we have lay people trained to actually go out and support as visitors. And because in our day and age, remember loneliness, isolation, hopelessness, all of these things are reasons that people consider that being dead would be better than not. So our challenges today are we need to have prophetic resistance to the inappropriate use of technology and to the medicalization of human suffering. We really need to promote and improve palliative care. The sin of the 2015 Supreme Court decision was made before Canada ever delivered on the promise that it made 12 years ago, that accessible, effective palliative care would be the right of every Canadian. I worked with Sharon Carstairs on multiple federal and national committees on that. So we need to have, if you don't have palliative care, then people in fact are terrified that they're not going to be cared for well. And then finally, we, each and every one of us, need to give our own prophetic witness to mercy, care, and companionship to all of those in our midst. So there's challenges, but what's at stake here is either an understanding of the message of the resurrection or a rejection. Only when Jesus was in the tomb, when all seemed lost, when he had given over entirely to trusting in the Father, was it possible for him to rise and possible for you and me to be here. The medicalization of all suffering is a serious blow to the understanding of all things spiritual and the resurrection in particular. So those are some of my thoughts.
Wow, thank you. There is so much in there. I am sure that people have a ton of questions now coming out of this conversation, and I see some of them coming in already. So if people do have questions, we only have about 15 minutes for questions. So please start typing them in now. So far, the only question is a comment from Michael, and that says fabulous. I totally agree, Michael. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that conversation. There's so much richness. Does anybody else have any questions or something they would like to contribute to this conversation? I know there was a lot in there. It would be good to hear from people. I guess I think it's an obvious question that I have, but I'm going to ask it anyway, sister. Would you say this move towards medically assisted death is really just a method of, would it be avoiding an acknowledgement somehow of death in our culture? Or do you think it's more just an economic question, not wanting to keep people alive? Or where do you think that that move comes from? Because it seems, I think you pointed out, it's quite a drastic change actually that took place from 12 years ago to 5 years ago. There wasn't a lot of room there to try something different.
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent question. I'll tell you that, in fact, that question itself has been the object of a seminar that I've been involved in. I actually think the two key issues, and then I'll talk about ancillary ones, but the two key issues really, and I know the proponents of the Supreme Court decision. I remember Canada, I mean, I was involved with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, helping them fight Bill C-84, whatever that one. When we attempted since issues in Quebec 30 years ago, where the issue of refusal of high technology got confused with the request to have your life ended. Remember, the refusal of technology is not assisted suicide. It's letting the nature take its course with care. But what I know from all of those who are protagonists for this, and I know them directly, and the key players here, this is essentially a rights and freedoms issue. That's why it's the BC Civil Liberties Union in the BC case. When they failed with legislative attempts at this, what then happened was a group decided the only way to get this done was to take the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and wait till we saw a Charter of Rights and Freedoms claim that they were being prevented from exercising their right of medically assisted death, go to a sympathetic judge. And that happened in Vancouver. But it was the BC Civil Liberty, it's the Civil Liberties Union that was the vehicle to get that there. So it has to do with absolutely positively with choice. It does have to do, as you rightly noted, it does have to do with this notion of suffering. And to be able to make the distinction, in fact, I'll use this. I have a wonderful slide, but it couldn't use it with everything we had. I have a slide that asks people to think about the difference between pain and suffering. And then what I show them is a little cardiogram with a heart in the middle. And I ask them to think about the difference between, to make that pain and suffering distinction clear, what's the difference between chest pain, angina, from a heart attack, and heartache because your son is lost to drugs and prostitution in downtown Toronto. Chest pain. Hey, me and my colleagues, do we have stuff that we can do for you? We can ream it out, we can zap it, we can replace it. We got stuff we can do for you. Heartache. So part of it has to do with, we've now conflated everything, and with the rejection of the religious worldview, there is no meaning to suffering. It's meaningless. So you combine that then with this dominance of the technological, the belief that it can answer all of our questions. But I then want to throw in something that you added, that of course the issue of pandemic and moral distress of caregivers in the pandemic situation, to show how that has aggravated all of this. You mentioned quite wisely that there may well be economic considerations. Look, I have seen papers published on the economic benefits of medical assistance in dying, because one of the things that has happened is if we have an inappropriate use, elderly population in particular, or chronically ill, or persons with handicap, with chronic handicap, the older they get, the more their healthcare needs are. And if we're bringing them back and forth for unnecessary, unwanted, aggressive medical interventions rather than reasonable care, I mean, I have seen things published because I do ethics and end of life in long-term care as well. The tsunami of the healthcare costs of the elderly and the chronically ill and the chronically mentally ill. Look at mental illness as the sole condition, and yet consent. This is supposed to be about choice. So you can be depressed and want to have your life ended just because you have depression. Seriously, but how do you give consent to depression when you've rejected treatment for depression and want death as an end of life? And then the final thing that we had mentioned it before we started, and I'll say it again. I want folks to think about this. So it's not just rejection of the worldview, the religious worldview has had a huge amount. Our valorization in the West on autonomy and control. But if we had gone back to the beginning of the 20th century, we don't have to go that far. Most people in history would have had worries and fears about death. What happens to me when I die? Is there an afterlife? Is that all there is? As Peggy Lee said, is that all there is? Is there a light? Is there, what is death? That's what they were concerned about. That's not what this is concerned about. They don't seem to have any worries at all. You hear nobody reflecting on that. Then again, I said, there's an assumption that you've stopped suffering if you're dead. The issue that we're concerned about is the dying process, partly because of that concern that was legitimate about unwanted technology. But now this is paradoxical. We didn't want all the extra junk. Now we want the junk, the technology, which can do wonderful things now, to in fact have death as the treatment.
Thank you. There's a number of questions that have come in now that I will start to go through here. So Joe says, I worked in a hospice for 5 years and my life was changed. It breaks my heart that we do not have access to proper palliative care across the country. What do you recommend I do to expand palliative care?
Well, Joe, thank you for saying that. And I mean, I know I know so many wonderful people who, including palliative care docs and nurses, and those who founded hospitals and who have run them. That's exactly the experience. And you do know the Canadian Palliative Care Association itself rejected this notion. But in fact, there have been very prominent palliative care docs, individuals who've made this issue that it should be part of the portfolio, part of the medical bag of techniques. What we have to, here's an example of our prophetic witness to mercy, care, and companionship requires, this is political advocacy. This is really, I mean, right now, everybody's so concerned about Bill C7 and whether or not conscientious objection is going to be there, that the timing right now for this political advocacy, it isn't the right time. But I'll tell you, Joe, that if it goes the way I fear, and in fact, doctors are never going to be able, I mean, I have all kinds of Roman Catholic doctors saying, Nuala, I'm not going to be able to practice. I'm going to have to opt out of medicine because of my beliefs of the sanctity of life. What is that? So if this goes through in the most extreme form, and even if it doesn't, when this conscientious objection issue gets settled some, this will be the time when more than ever before, we have to have a viable option. We have to be able to support and provide the, and my language is, because that was the one, Sharon Carstairs was wonderful, the senator, to work on this, effective, accessible hospice and palliative care. This is a political activity, a political advocacy issue.
I'm actually just going to jump to one of the questions because it's right on this question of conscientious objection for doctors. And Darcy asked, what is the reason for Parliament's omission of conscientious objection for doctors? If it's not clear, do you have a theory?
What's the reason for Parliament's?
For the Parliament's omission of conscientious objection for doctors.
Oh, it's all right. So super question, because it is central to where we are now. All right. So two things that become crucial. And there's review of the literatures. There's some wonderful stuff by a number of Catholic writers on this too. There's a total misunderstanding of conscience. Conscience in the public forum has come to be understood as personal idiosyncratic values. And therefore, in a public realm, like the difference between the doctor's personal life and professional obligations is seen totally separate. And in that, I mean, it's not Parliament. There has been a huge movement. Remember, both the Supreme Court of Canada decision and Bill C-14 promised that there would be conscientious objection. That in fact, you could say, I do not, in my practice, I just want you to know in my practice, if doctors are required to respond with performance of MAID to the requests, imagine that being forced. I'm not going to be forced to provide a certain antibiotic. I make the decision which one I think is appropriate. Forced to provide or to refer, a defective referral means to someone who will immediately make it easy for this to happen, then the conscience issue becomes one of, in your professional obligations, you can't have that freedom. And by the way, neither can institutions. Look, the Catholic hospitals who have had a temporary kind of protection on this, I'm sorry, I've told everyone. I was the ethics and health advisor to the Catholic Health Alliance when I retired from full-time at the university. I'm telling you that there's no protection for institutional conscience either. If you're a Catholic hospital, I'm sorry, because the fact that that's where hospitals came from, and the source of funding, the funding goes to the care of the patient. So, but this, in our day and age, conscience is a dirty word. And I use that when I write and speak. So it's seen to be personal and idiosyncratic. And in fact, a whole host of people who want no restrictions on access of individuals who say, I'm suffering and this is what I want and you have to provide it for me. So I think the conscience issue is central to the question, but it's in large part because its understanding is so different. Because for us, and by the way, that's another thing, And Father Michael, if you're still on, you can help me with this one.
Wasn't Father Michael.
With all my priest and bishop friends, the ones that I know and love, and there's wonderful ones, because I deal with the abuse crisis. I know how much they're in agony. We have not taught Catholics how to form their conscience. Catholics think conscience historically has been whatever the magisterium tells you. I'm sorry, but there are 4 elements in Catholic conscience. So Joe, whoever answer the next question, I just like Joe's always good. The 4 elements are, first and foremost, it's Scripture. We form our conscience based on what we know about Scripture. God, Jesus' revelation, Holy Spirit, Trinity, it's Scripture. Second source is tradition, comma, especially magisterial teaching. Remember, I showed you moral teaching, and some of that goes way back. But it's the second component. Third is experience. In this day, in this age, can you imagine, with the pressures of COVID, having sick elderly people and all of this MAID stuff? I mean, compounding on. So experience, where are you? Reading the signs of the times would be the way that we might have understood it in John 23rd understanding. And then the final is reason, including science. So that's, for example, why some of the stuff about our sexual morality is just missing advances in human science. But those are the 4 pillars. So what happened was we went from Catholics thinking the second one, whatever the magisterium explicitly said is what you do, without taking into account all those other elements, including the particular circumstances. And then when we need it, when we want bishops and clerics call for Catholics to object, do conscientious objection to this, when Catholics have not been able to have formed conscience. So I think there's a complexity, but I have never heard a sermon, a homily, or a homily. I've heard many of both. I have never heard a sermon or a homily on the formation of conscience. Everything I know about that, I know that from stuff that has happened in my religious community or my own spiritual and theological reading and reflection.
Next question. Should we promote advanced care planning through our parishes?
Yes. So this is something that I can actually send you. I am working excuse me, in my own diocese, and I was working in the Diocese of Antigonish, our partner diocese. The bishop there, Dunn, was the bishop there before he's become my new archbishop. But in both these dioceses, we've been working on this issue, and we have a number of fantastic Catholic lay people who have been helping with it. We actually have a little booklet on it. I should have had one to wave to you, on advanced care planning as a spiritual activity from the Catholic Christian perspective. It summarizes some of the moral teaching that I just showed you, but it's a little booklet. And I mean, I'm the one who's the author. These people are helping me with it. So, I mean, if this is helpful, I could send that to you, and you could make that accessible to anybody who might use it, because it does 2 things. And my folk, especially the folks in Immaculate Conception Parish in Truro, Nova Scotia, the woman up there who runs this, she's just so amazing. She keeps saying to me, Sister Nuala, the thing that's the best about this is it actually is a vehicle for catechesis. You're actually helping teach things that people, because going through the tradition, but in more depth and with the ability to reflect upon it. The other thing is that you're also being able to use it with small groups so they can share their reflections of being there at the bedside. Because let's also be very clear about something, just so you know. I know that there are difficult deaths. As a physician, I said, when done well, hardly anyone needs to request medically assisted death for pain control. But I do know that pain, shortness of breath, and seizure activity can provide some of the most complex end-of-life care. And we need far more research in how to deal medically with managing those, so those don't become the precipitant for individuals to think they need to end their lives. So one of the problems that we see, and I think maybe and this with the advocacy one again, once medically assisted death is normalized, and I write about the normalization occurred breathtakingly fast, then money for research into palliative care, money into research for difficult death and appropriate management dries up. Research money is hard enough to get.
One last comment here. Jan says, I appreciate your comments so much. I was a palliative care visitor for many years before I retired, and I resonated with your comment about the role of compassion for those supporting a person having a good death. I found the role of companionship for death and dying to be a real privilege. My question is whether you think our communities will continue to increase the number of palliative care beds because there is such a shortage of these beds in light of the current legislation.
So, and so what she just described there is exactly we can go to a number of areas of my diocese where I have just amazing experiences of people who've been parish visitors and what we're calling in my diocese Ministry of Care and Companionship. I go back to the resources question because there's two things that could happen. What I just predicted, which is now that there's medically assisted death, there will be less money for hospice and palliative care. Or we can actually make some effective advocacy and ensure that there's more. I look on this one, I'm not a betting person anyway. I'm too darn stingy to put down. But in terms of my instinct, I live in hope. I'm a daughter of the resurrection. I believe my Savior lives. I believe Jesus is real to me. But on this one, I don't think I'd bet anything. Because the normalization of medically assisted death, the rejection of the religious worldview. Again, just go back to this, and this is maybe where I'll leave this. In the comments with my medical folks in the conversation we had last night, the very painful one, I kept saying, look, the only hope that we've got here, and I don't know if I said it to you at the beginning, but I don't know if I said it to the group, in conscientious objection, is because our Indigenous persons have in fact requested it. And the reality is they now have, it's overdue for them to have political clout. Please understand, I'm not demeaning the need for restorative justice and political recognition for them. But I mean, what about traditional Catholic religious worldviews? The minute you say Catholic, it's not, we have so changed the dialogue in the public square that the minute you say Catholic, they assume you're biased as if they weren't and have no place to participate. And again, some of that has to do is, God love us, even good people don't necessarily know how to speak in the public arena in a way that can speak truth to power, as Jesus would have wanted us to do, and accept the fact that if you do that, you're going to be in trouble with some. Jesus suffered because he spoke truth to power and because he spoke the truth of the Beatitudes to those who wanted to maintain power.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful place to leave our conversation today. Please do send me those documents. And then if anybody would like that information, you can send it to me. Don't send it to the email that reminded you about this webinar, because that is the IT department. If you can send it directly to myself, that's annette.donovanpancho@kings.uwo.ca. That's available on our website where you would have found out about this, or on the Facebook page. I can make sure that you get those documents. Thank you, Sister Nuala. That was an incredible way to kind of incredible conversation for a Thursday afternoon. I really, really appreciate all of your insights. And I think you have fired me up anyway, and I'm sure fired up many people to continue this conversation with so many other people and to think about ways that we can advocate for this too. Yeah, so Mary is saying, thank you, sister, please come back.
So let me just end with the thought just came into my head. So let me end with this. It's not a prayer which I ordinarily would contribute, but it kind of sort of. It's from the funeral liturgy, where we're reminded that the life and death of each of us affects all of us. I mean, and Jesus said, if one suffers, we all suffer. We don't believe that we are individuals in our own little world. We believe we are members of a body that is interdependent, the body of Christ. But we believe that the life and death and how it happens for all affects us and ours affects them. We are connected in ways that require that we attempt to help heal the body of Christ whenever we can.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll see many of you back again next week for our final Catholic Current. We have Father Doug McDonald here. And until then, have a wonderful week. Take care, and thank you once again, Sister Nuala. Bye-bye.